It's a special pleasure, Lionel, to interview you. You're here in the United States. You've just given a talk to Harvard students. I wanted to ask you about the euro debt crisis, the aftermath of that crisis. Can the euro be saved? Can the eurozone be saved? How is Europe going to emerge from this particular crisis?
Well, I think that in the initial stages, the response was quite effective. The European Central Bank was spotted earlier that there was a liquidity problem, and they acted ahead of the Federal Reserve. I think subsequently, Europeans have somewhat gone their own way, and we've had a confusion between a fiscal crisis with countries having excessive debt, particularly in the south, in Portugal, Spain, Italy, and a banking crisis. And in this respect, the Europeans were very slow to deal with the banking problems, slower than the United States, slower to recapitalize, slower to recognize in public that they were, had serious bad assets on their balance sheets. And in that respect, I put America ahead of Europe.
Interesting. You know, part of this drama has been a look at the leadership in Europe itself. You look back 20 years ago at German unification, you see this very strong leadership from Chancellor Kohl, from Gorbachev even, from President George H.W. Bush at that time. Have we seen such strong leadership from Angela Merkel and Nicolas Sarkozy especially, and is that in part, do you think, a reason why Europe reacted so slowly to this unraveling crisis in Greece?
Well, I believe that the diplomacy behind German unification was one of the finest episodes in post-war history. You mentioned the major figures: Helmut Kohl, François Mitterrand, George H.W. Bush.
Margaret Thatcher.
Margaret Thatcher was somewhat... she came round in the end.
Yes.
She came round in the end, but Mikhail Gorbachev, and this was managed peacefully and effectively.
Yes.
And real political leadership and effective crisis management. If you contrast that with somewhat faltering efforts, and then an attempt to set up a new institution to reflect the new realities of different locations of power, different balance of power in the world, the G20. Initially good start, a decision to recapitalize the banks and take regulatory measures, but since then somewhat in disarray. And I think that's partly because that each country has decided to go its own way. And therefore a real striking contrast with what happened 20 years ago.
Is there a sentiment in Britain, especially now, that Britain made the correct decision to stay out of the Eurozone?
Without question. I think that is a view shared not just by the Financial Times, but by many other actors in Britain. Without the ability to adjust the exchange rate, you can't obviously do that if you're in a monetary union, the British economy would be in severe trouble. And indeed, we had a crisis, a financial crisis, born not just in the property market, excessive house prices, but the banks were over-leveraged in too much debt. And if we'd been in the monetary union, imagine, with those low interest rates in the early part of the decade, the bigger the bubble and the bigger the pop.
So now looking forward, two countries that I think are particularly interesting, Britain and Greece. Britain, for the historic reductions in defense spending and government spending announced by Prime Minister Cameron last week. Is it your sense that the package was sufficiently large to calm the financial markets and to put Britain on better footing for the future?
Now, Nick, as a bearer of the British Bulldog spirit, I'm somewhat taken aback by the fact that you're mentioning Britain and Greece in the same breath, but that's all right. The fact is that the deficit spending reductions that are being undertaken in Britain are very painful, and they will have a profound effect on the ability of Britain to project power. We will look back on the Blair era as perhaps the high watermark of intervention.
A British military,
British
political
military, political power, exactly. So we're having to adjust to somewhat straitened circumstances. I don't obviously think that we're in quite the same boat as the Greeks, because they do not only have a very high budget deficit, as high as the Brits. Brits had a 11 plus 12% budget deficit GDP, but the Greeks have debt too, very high debt, and that's also going to increase in the short term. But I don't deny that there is very painful adjustment in both countries.
Staying with Britain just for a moment, and I didn't mean to suggest any kind of linkage between them, but countries to watch, because Britain has received quite a lot of commendation on this side of the Atlantic, with some exceptions, for having had the political guts, the Cameron government, to make a very, very strong gesture to Britain's economic future. But there's concern, as you said, about the ability of Britain to punch its weight, to continue to punch well above its weight, I should say, in the foreign and defense policy realm. For the U.S., it's difficult to imagine a global policy without working with Britain in the military sphere. Can Britain retain its the deployability of its forces and the self-confidence of its forces to deploy anywhere in the world that it's had over the last 10 or 15 years? Can it retain it after absorbing such large budget reductions in the defense ministry?
I think it's going to be harder, because you have to remember, Nick, and of course our fellow Americans, fellow allies in America have been in the same position, fighting 2 wars in 1 decade.
Enormously expensive.
Enormously expensive, in cost, in terms of treasure and blood, losses, casualties seen every day. That's tough. I think we do have the ability, we do have the residual political will to continue this, but it's not open-ended. David Cameron does want to move towards an exit, not overnight, but an exit from Afghanistan. Now, the broader question you're talking about, which is intervention, the ability to project force, I think we still want to have that, and Mr. Cameron intervened right at the end of that debate to say we want to maintain, to have the 2 aircraft carriers. That obviously offers the ability to project force, even if we've only got a few planes on top of those aircraft carriers. But this is a very important part of the, if you like, the British psyche, British part of the British makeup.
Course.
We're just not going to be able to do as much and as reflexively as we did during the Blair-Bush era.
Thank you. I wanted to ask you a question about Greece. In my judgment, Greece has a very courageous, intelligent prime minister who's done the right thing in framing the problem for the Greek people and taking some very tough and difficult austerity measures. Do you think that Greece can survive this crisis without a default? And do you think there's a possibility that Greece might have to leave the Eurozone if it can't meet the targets that have been established for it now by its lenders, the European Union, of course, and also the IMF?
Well, first of all, Nick, I just think that we should give the credit to the Greek government for finally, they were late on it, and previous governments were certainly late on it. They falsified the data, economic data, to get into the Eurozone. They didn't take the tough measures needed to sustain membership of the Eurozone. Having said all that, they are now really taking some very painful, distasteful medicine in terms of deficit reduction, in terms of adapting the economy to the modern circumstances where you don't have everybody not paying tax, etc. Now, question, default or not? It's not a given that the Greeks will default. They do have this twin burden of excessive deficit and excessive debt. And that will be very difficult to manage if, as I suspect, they're going to have low growth going forward. But if the Greek government, this courageous Greek government, can, by the time, they've got time because of the rescue earlier this year, in the 2-year period to regain some confidence in the financial markets, then there may be a prospect of a debt rescheduling, which the markets support, which will allow them to avoid a default, which, if it did come to that, it seemed to me would raise a big question mark about whether Greece could maintain its membership of the monetary union.
Thank you. I want to ask you to turn your lens on the United States. You're a long-term observer of our country. You've lived here. You know our political system very well. How have we emerged from this economic crisis? I mean, everyone understands that our economic power is the basis of our global power. Do you have any concerns about that as you see the way the Obama administration and the Bush administration before it reacted to the crisis, and as you talk to people in financial markets all over the world? Are we stronger or weaker than we were, say, 3 years ago?
There's no question that America is a weaker country. This country has taken a real dent to its collective self-confidence. Talked about Britain earlier. I think that's equally true here of the United States. If you have the kind of bubble that we've gone through, and then the kind of adjustment, the pop, where people's whose wealth confidence was caught up in their own home ownership, and then you see people losing their homes, foreclosures.
Yeah.
This is on an individual scale, it's serious, but then collectively, let's talk about how the elite, have they absorbed the degree to which American power is diminished? America still remains, the top military power, immensely influential political, but they have lost the monopoly of economic power. They're having to adjust to a world in which other countries, notably China, are emerging. Not directly to confront, but it means that America just cannot act in the same unilateral fashion that it's been accustomed to in the post-war era.
That's a very important statement. This question, in my judgment, is not being debated in the current political campaign for the midterm elections. It's a question that our government going forward, both the Congress and the executive, have to get their arms around. Do you think the United States is capable of the kind of structural economic change that the President Obama has put forward in order to rescue this economy from further sliding down?
Well, the risk is that the administration will emerge post the midterms in a weakened state with the divided government, Republicans, an obstructionist Republican majority in the House, confronting the administration, and nothing being done. More inaction, more paralysis. Where, as an outside observer and a student of American government, and one who grew up on the Founding Fathers, reading the Federalist Papers at Oxford, and then having spent 10 years in this country, I'm struck by the questions that people are beginning to ask about whether the system of government is capable of managing this crisis effectively and taking the necessary painful steps. And I think there are some questions there, and I worry a little bit about it. I worry about the natural reaction in the Congress to just take, well, we've got to lash out against someone, we'll take selective protectionist measures. These kind of actions which could have a very detrimental effect on the alliances that America has around the world, as well as destabilizing the financial markets.
Right. A final question, Lionel. It's about the future of your business. Much debated here is the fate of our great newspapers and the fate of our smaller regional and city newspapers. Lots of newspapers closing. Of course, profit margins being diminished, advertisers going away. Are you seeing that same phenomenon in Britain? And as editor of one of the world's major papers, do you have confidence that the print media is going to surmount these challenges, obviously in a transformed way, in a modern way, but that newspapers will still be relevant 20 and 30 years from now?
I think we have to now talk about the news business, not the newspaper business. We have to understand that there are many new forms and platforms for the dissemination of news and analysis and information. We have to just get used to that. This country has had many fine newspapers, too many, by the way, that have been dominant in the metropolis and not had the kind of vicious, fierce competition that we have in the British newspaper market, and therefore have failed to innovate, failed to move fast enough to embrace
because of lack of competition.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think, therefore, there is a huge adjustment. We're in the middle of a hurricane in this country in terms of the way the internet revolution has changed business models, challenged business models. The way I believe that newspapers will survive. They're going to change in the way they look. They are going to adapt. They're going to be able to take advantage of these new tablets, the iPad, for example. Yeah. People are excited about reading, having a newspaper experience in an interactive form. So overall, I'm optimistic about the news business, and I'm optimistic about the newspaper business as long as it understands that it has to move beyond the print form.
Thank you very much, Lionel. Thank you for us today.
Thanks, Nick.
Thank you.